Let's get it started in here.
The viewpoints of J. Michael McCoy, his co-hosts, guests, and callers are not necessarily those of any particular religion or denomination. They may or may not be the views of Webcast One Live, the cleaning guy, the woman who brings in cookies, the parking valet, the staff of The View from a Pew, Jill King, Lucinda, the graphic design lady, Justin, Bob, Brian, Linda, or anyone else of sound mind or questionable mental capacity. Should you be offended, provoked, triggered, intimidated, shocked, confused, or inspired to think independently, call our studio lines at 515-442-KPOG and join the conversation. After all, it's your voice we want to hear. Now, live from the Jordan Crossing Studios, here's your host,
Frank the Verse Thomas.
Well, hello, it is Frank the Verse Thomas, and we're here at View from the Pew. That's heard every Monday through Friday at Jordan Crossing Church at the...
Live from the Yellow Blue Studios, your home for the light from LED Lighting. This is KPOG Grimes, West Des Moines.
If you'd like to share in the show and give me your comments or your questions or your input, you can do so by following this set of instructions.
We want to hear from you, so give us a call on the Service Legends Talk and Text line, 515-442-5764. That's 515-442-KPOG.
If you've not been living in a cave over the weekend, mass shootings, one in El Paso, Texas, and the other in Dayton, Ohio. Apparently, I was out mowing some grass and doing some yard work yesterday and came in and finished watching a few laps of the NASCAR race, and must have been a shooting going on yesterday in Dayton. So I have some thoughts about that I'd like to share with you here in a little bit. But first, I need to get something tagged here in the show. And let me see. Let me try that one more time. Okay. I'll delete one of these. All right. So we're here. It's a Monday. Some people used to call Manic Mondays manic. It seems kind of like that's the case today with these shootings over the weekend. But I have some interesting stories I would like to share with you. That I think you will find interesting. We're going to get to our Sabbath school lesson, and that is around 5:30. And the lesson for today is called "A Reason to Worship," and we will catch up with Sabbath, Sunday, and Monday. So today's lesson is a reason to worship, and we will catch up with the other two around 5:30. Till that, I have some news stories that I would like to share with you. And let me just pull up my Facebook post that I shared earlier of some suggestions that I believe can potentially help. So we had a couple of shootings over the weekend, a shooting in El Paso, and I've heard all kinds of different reports who this shooter particularly supported as a candidate for the president of the United States. And I think a lot of that is just people who have nothing better to do. I I see a post on Facebook that says the Dayton shooter supported Elizabeth Warren. The guy that sent the pipe bombs or the potential bombs to the congressional people over the last year was sentenced today. Cesar Sayoc. Of course, people are attributing his things to being a person who admires Donald Trump. The guy that shot the ball players at the park was a supporter of Bernie Sanders. So I think we just need to take a big time out and call these shootings for what they are. The people who do it are evil. They can make up any kind of excuse they want to about who they support, who they don't support. I've heard all kinds of reports over the weekend. The bottom line is it's the people who are at fault. Now, in a story I'd like to share with you off of one of my email servers, pops up this story. Overwhelmed Chicago hospital has to turn away gun victims. Mount Sinai had so many trauma patients it was forced to temporarily turn away new ones. In a weekend marred by mass shootings in Texas and Ohio, Chicago registered its own weekend of gun violence chaos with more than 4 people gunned down. That's 48 people shot, at least 7 fatally, in various shootings around the city, WLS reports. The carnage was so bad in the Windy City, in fact, one hospital had to go on bypass, meaning that for a few hours Sunday morning it had to turn away incoming patients arriving by ambulance because it was already dealing with too many trauma patients. Because, okay, caught that part. A representative for Mount Sinai Hospital tells CNN that during its most hectic moments early Sunday, it had to send incoming ambulances to one of other 5 trauma centers in the area. The hospital started accepting patients again by 6:30 a.m., just a few hours after the on-bypass mandate was issued. But the plethora of shooting victims over the weekend, both in Chicago and elsewhere, didn't escape the notice of local law enforcement. Chicago PD Representative Anthony Guglielmi noted a tragic 20 hours for our country, while Police Chief Eddie Johnson lamented the state of things. In a Sunday presser, you have to stop and ask yourself, what will it take before we get a handle on what's going on, not only in Chicago, but across the country? Now, reason why I want to share this story. I do not understand for the life of me when this is just about a daily and weekly occurrence in Chicago. I do not understand for the life of me why we focus on these shootings in Gilroy, California, Dayton, Ohio, and El Paso, Texas, when we have cities like Baltimore and Chicago where these things happen almost on a nightly, daily occurrence. And it doesn't even so much as make the news. It takes something like Christian Breaking News, or it takes some other outlet for us to get this type of news. This is just standard life in Chicago, Illinois. This is one of our major cities in the United States, and this stuff goes on, and it goes almost nightly without so much as even a report on the cable news networks. You don't hear nothing about it on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. You hear nothing about it. But if you get some mass shooting then all of a sudden it is wall-to-wall coverage on the cable news networks. And they will just take, for example, the Gilroy, California shooting at quote-unquote the Garlic Festival. I happen to be tuned into that a little bit. And they played a loop, a loop of the cell phone video that somebody had sent into Fox News. And they just looped that thing over and over and over, what seemed like at least an hour, may have been into 2 hours. They have nothing new to say. They have no new facts to tell you. They have nothing at all, but they just keep replaying things over and over and over and over while talking heads in the background comment, and they bring in police officers and officials and different people to talk, and they literally know new facts. Of course, there's the old saying in news, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's kind of sad. But let me share with you something that 10 things that I think will help solve the problem with these mass shootings. Number one, stop giving these shootings wall-to-wall coverage on the cable news networks. Number two, ban the sale and production of violent video games. Because I think one of the common denominators with a lot of these shootings is kids having a history of playing these violent video games. Number three, address the serious issue of bullying in our schools. You see, I've got some relatives that's got a child who is addicted, seriously addicted to video games, to the point of panic and anxiety if he's told to get off the games. The kid doesn't literally want to go to school because he's so focused on these video games. And one of the things that invariably happens when you get so intensely focused on playing these video games, you get filled with rage and anger because you become so one-minded. Your focus becomes so one-minded on defeating the game, playing the game, getting to some higher level, that when you can't attain these higher levels, you start slamming and breaking the controllers. And this is something that adults have even reported, a phenomenon that happens when adults play these video games. So you get bullied at school. You come home, you start playing these games where you're just shooting people indiscriminately, randomly. There's no name to these people. There's no story of their life, their pains, their struggles in life. It's just random people. In some of these Warcraft and some of these military-style shooting video games and the Grand Theft Autos and several of these other style of games. Number four, stop the over-medicating of our children just for being overactive. Number five, get people who have serious mental disorders help or put away. Number six, stop addressing symptoms and get to the real issue and the root causes of man's hate for his fellow man. Again, we're swatting at flies when we talk about, well, it's the gun's fault. The problem of it is you can treat a cancerous lesion on your arm with some topical salve. You can heal the cancerous lesion on the topical with topical salve on your arm, but you still have cancer in your body. So you've healed something, but the root cause of what caused the lesion in the first place is still contained inside your body. It's the same with the gun is just the symptom. The video games are the symptom. A lot of these things are the symptom. We need to address root causes. Number 7, stop blaming the gun. Stop blaming the knife. Stop blaming the bomb, the explosive device, and stop blaming the truck that people use to run somebody over. Call out the evil, which is the person who is committing or has committed the crime. Number 8, reinstate public executions for the folks responsible for these crimes after an expedited trial. I mean, there's no question. The guns have the people's fingerprints and DNA all over the guns. The victim may have, or the perpetrator may have the blood splatters of his victims on his body. There's no doubt whatsoever who committed the crime. Now, if there's some issue where we're not quite sure, maybe there was multiple shooters involved, then you might have a little bit more of a sticky wicket, as they say. But in these single shooter events where they absolutely know who committed the crime, expedited trial, and a public execution, I think, is called for. Let people see who are contemplating these types of events what exactly is going to happen to you when you commit that heinous crime. Number 9, we have to absolutely harden soft targets. When I leave my house in the morning to come into this studio, I drive by, and I'm not going to say what they are because I don't want to call any attention to them, but I drive by 3 or 4 really soft targets that are just begging to be hit. And as I said, I'm not going to name these targets because I don't want to give anybody listening any ideas. But the idea that we can go through life and we can allow certain of our public events, certain of our things go without security and protection with concrete barriers and security, armed force, it's those days are over. Number 10, and the final one, is no more gun-free zones. Apparently, from everything that was reported in the El Paso shooting, the Walmart, or the mall that the Walmart was housed in, was a gun-free zone. So potential good citizens who may have been able to stop this perpetrator might have been able to dispatch this guy, wouldn't have been able to carry their gun on them into this mall, into the Walmart legally. So if they would have pulled a gun, shot this guy, they would probably be up for some liability. That's just 10 suggestions I have that I think would help. But immediately what happens is it turns into a political coup d'etat to take away guns from all lawful, law-abiding citizens. Most of these guns that are obtained are stolen. They may be purchased legally. There's no real laws that you can make. Some people who attain these things go through lawful background checks. There's all kinds of things. Now, one of the things that was supposedly happened in the shooting in Dayton, Ohio, was it was reported that this guy was armed with several 100-round clips of ammo. I don't know what he was shooting. All the facts hasn't come out yet, but he had at least 250 rounds of ammo on him and may have had more in his trunk of his car. So we'll see more facts in the days to come. But I just want to make the point. A gun is not intrinsically evil. A knife, a fork, an explosive, and a truck, a car, is not an intrinsically evil item. It is who picks up the gun, picks up the knife, picks up the explosive, or gets in to drive the truck or the car or the van that has the problem. Just as I've mentioned a number of times, a gun can protect your life. A gun could commit a crime. A knife is something that you can do a lot of wonderful things. You can fillet your food. You can process your food with the knife, and you can also do terrible damage to someone with a knife. Same with an explosive. A lot of explosives, a lot of dynamite was used in the development of this country to build monuments, build infrastructure, build bridges, blow holes and tunnels in mountainsides, to construct highways through a mountainside, construct train tracks and train tunnel through a mountainside. Explosives is something that can take out stumps, where if you're trying to develop a piece of land into farmland and you've got a bunch of stumps that need removed, you can use dynamite to take stumps out of the ground. You can do all sorts of things, but it can also be used for evil. You know, it's the same thing when I was a kid and the Polaroid cameras come out, and that was the first time that you could take a photograph and not have to take it into a film developer to get it filmed. Well, you can imagine that people really enjoyed taking pictures of their children and things, and taking photographs instantaneously and pulling it off and watching the picture develop before your eyes. But then people soon figured out sexually deviant things to do with these cameras also, along with the video cams, etc. There's always a plus and a minus to everything we do. There's always a good use and a bad use. So guns is not an intrinsically evil item, no more than a camera is, no more than a fork, a knife, an explosive, a bomb, a car, a truck, a van. It's just an instrument. It's like the old Archie Bunker episodes back in the 70s when I was a kid. Gloria, his daughter, and Mike Stivic were talking about all the gun violence and how many people were killed yearly by handguns. To which Archie Bunker said, well, little girl, would it make you feel any better if they were hit in the head with bricks? No. The method of demise is not the issue. It's what is in man's heart that causes so much hatred of his fellow man that he would go indiscriminately, randomly shooting and harming people he does not know. Now, it would be one thing if you had a enemies list who you were going out and you were trying to systematically dispose of enemies, but this is not the case. This is not the case. This is just someone taking out their anger, their bitterness, their frustration on random people that they have no idea what their pains, what their struggles, what their issues are in life. So again, let's stop with the political nonsense. Let's just look for real solutions to solve the problem and not just a knee-jerk, well, everybody's got to give up their guns. Well, what happens when somebody starts mowing people down with trucks, vans? Well, does everybody have to give up their trucks and vans? Does everybody have to give up their kitchen utensils? Again, it's not the method of demise that's the problem. It's address the root cause of why someone would want to do his fellow man so much harm, cause them so much pain. Because the perpetrator is often in pain themselves, and they would like to inflict pain on others, it seems, in many of these cases. So let's start addressing the root causes, stop swiping at symptoms, and get focused on this and what we can do as a church to start promoting love for thy fellow man, not evil for thy fellow man. So here's a story from Christian Breaking News. It deals with this a little bit. No, the United States doesn't lead the world in mass shootings. Here is the real data. Unlike Langford, we took a lot of time to find all the foreign cases we could. We even got a translator to identify cases using the same definition of public mass shooters that Langford used. We found that he grossly undercounted foreign attacks. Of the 86 countries where we've identified that any mass public shooting occurred, the United States of America, ranks 62nd. Excerpt from John Stossel TV video. As expected, many immediately began politicizing the shootings in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio. Quite a few of them even blamed our current president. Like clockwork, calls for more gun control have commenced. Politicians are trying to pressure Mitch McConnell to cancel the Senate recess so they can vote on gun control. A playground near the image shows in this story a crime scene tape around a baseball field cordoned off with police tape as the investigation continued at the scene in Alexandria, Virginia, Thursday, June 15, 2017, the day after House Majority Whip Steve Scalise of Louisiana was shot during a congressional baseball practice. A coming myth that you can expect to hear a lot in the coming days, or pardon me, a common myth, if I said coming, common myth in the coming days you're going to hear is that the United States leads the world in mass shootings, and therefore we must pass some gun laws that will do nothing to stop future mass shootings, but will infringe on the rights of law-abiding gun owners. Now, let me just stop and say, let me show you, let me demonstrate for you how ridiculous this is. Let's say for feeling good, we all come together and we make laws against bump stocks. We make laws against semi-automatics. We make laws against clip size. We make laws against silencers. We make laws against all kinds of things. Everybody feels good. Everybody's patting themselves on the back, background checks. We've done all kinds of things. We're patting ourselves on the back. What happens when none of the things passed through by law stop the next mass shooting? Well, then the natural logic would be, well, let's pass some more regulations. Let's pass some more laws. And it doesn't stop the next shooting. You see what happens when enough, quote unquote, and I'm air quoting now, when enough, quote unquote, reasonable gun restrictions are instituted, one day you're going to wake up and there will be no Second Amendment. You'll have no gun. Because you have to have a knee-jerk reaction each time something happens, and the only thing that people want to do is make more restrictions on guns, like the gun is the problem. They totally dismiss the mental illness of the potential mental illness of the person who committed the crime. They totally ignore other factors, from the fact that the average child, let me look this up. I've shared this before. Let me get this real quick. I've shared this with you before. By the time a child reaches the age of 18, okay? By the time you have a baby and that child reaches the age of 18, they will have seen 16,000 simulated murders and 200,000 acts of violence on television. Media violence can be hazardous to children's health, and studies point overwhelmingly to a causal connection between media violence and aggressive attitudes, values, and behaviors in some children. Through education in clinics, schools, and primary care offices, pediatric nurses can minimize the impact of media violence. They can obtain comprehensive and media histories on families and children. They can teach families and children about the effects of media violence and advise them how to avoid exposure. So, a child has seen on TV rapes, violence, assaults, murders, all kinds of violence by the time they reach the age of 18. We are becoming numb. Now, maybe a mature adult can handle some of this, but what about a child that's a little iffy? A little child that's on the border of having some anger and some mental illness issues? How does that child deal with that input into their brain, as it desensitizes the emotions and the feelings of someone else? Many of Hollywood movies are just victims. You know, go back and look at some of the Friday the 13th, the Halloween series of movies, where there was just person after person, woman after woman, who just scream in terror, in abject fear, abject terror at some evil thing coming after them, stalking them, chasing them, and then eventually murdering them. How does that play on the psyche of a young man or a young woman who has some they're marginally sane, let's just say. They have some potential schizophrenia, they have some potential bipolar, they have some potential real serious mental issues. And we wonder why these things happen. What you might not hear is this claim is totally bogus. So, if you follow the conservative media, you're probably aware of this. And others have also previously reported on how the myth of the United States leading the world in mass shootings is based on a deeply flawed study. Now, I'm not suggesting and I'm not arguing that mass murder in the United States isn't a problem. But we're not the worst in the world. But the solution to all this by certain political parties is just disarm America. Then all these people that has the hate figures out how to do it with explosives or run over people in garbage trucks, school buses, dump trucks, etc. You just figure out how to do that. So, again, let's get some real debate and some real sanity into the debate and stop just pointing fingers. Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun. Now, this is the truth. Okay? A gun doesn't pull its own trigger. Gun doesn't just hover in air and shoot itself. It takes someone to pull the trigger. So the gun is not the evil. The inanimate object, the gun, is not good or evil. It is the person using it. President Trump replies to shootings, condemns white supremacy, and calls for strong background checks. We cannot let those killed in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio die in vain. Likewise, for those so seriously wounded, we can never forget those who came before them. Republicans and Democrats must come together and get strong background checks, perhaps marrying this legislation with some desperately needed immigration reform. We must have something good, if not great, come out of these tragic events. President Donald Trump. With one voice, our nation should condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy, specifically addressing the apparent motive behind the El Paso massacre. Speaking from the White House, the president gave a broad assessment of the root causes behind America's ongoing problem with mass shootings, saying mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun. While the president isn't blaming guns, gun control advocates may get some of what they've been fighting for, as the president took to Twitter to push Congress to act on stronger background checks and immigration reform. Vigils are taking place on both sides of the border to remember the victims of Saturday's mass shooting in El Paso. 20 people were killed when a gunman began firing on people in a crowded Walmart. The suspect, 21, of Allen, Texas, was taken into custody without incident and is cooperating with investigators. He basically didn't hold anything back. Particular questions were asked and he responded. Investigators say the motive, according to him, was a hatred of immigrants, and according to a manifesto posted by the gunman, his goal was to stop the invasion of Hispanics. Well, I don't think that he got the job done. We are going to treat it as domestic terrorism, and we're going to do what we do to terrorists in this country, and that is to deliver swift and certain justice, says U.S. Attorney Josh Bash. Maribel Latin was shot while raising money for her child's soccer team. I had to pretend I was dead, and all I could say was, God, please take care of my children. Just 13 hours later, a second mass shooting, this time at a popular entertainment district in Dayton. Witness Gary Poland said people started running, and it's when I started hearing shots fired and bullets were just riddling. 9 people were killed, among them the alleged shooter's sister. Police were able to neutralize the gunman in less than a minute. Their amazing courage and response undoubtedly saved many, many, many lives, said Ohio Governor Mike DeWine. Although there's no known motive so far, high school classmates allege the shooter kept a hit list and a rape list of fellow students. Across the country, the calls for gun control from Congress are growing louder. So, again, let's just have some sanity to the situation and realize, stop trying to go to war with inanimate objects, and let's go to war with the root cause, and that's the sin and the evil and the rebellion that lies in the dark recesses of man's heart. That's where we need to start the focus. But the media won't want to focus on that because they want to pick at the low-hanging, easy fruit. Here is an article answering the tough questions, our next short course. A few weeks ago, I came across a video that you might call YouTube gold. That's the phrase used these days for an oldie but a goodie video. It was a Chuck Colson speech. He was speaking at a conference that was otherwise overly academic. But Chuck spoke with passion and conviction as he pounded the pulpit. At the end, several hundred, mostly academics, erupted in a standing ovation. Seriously, you got to see it. Chuck made 4 points. I'm only going to give you the first 2. And because these 2 are especially in need of repeating today. The first point is, Christians must develop a biblically formed worldview. At other times and places, broad cultural consensus may have lined up with Christian truth, but no more. Of course, that goes without saying. 20 years ago, when Chuck said this to his Grand Rapids audience, it was every bit as true, but not as obvious. Which brings up the second point. Not only do we need to develop a biblically formed worldview, but we need to know that worldview well enough to defend it. This is exactly what Peter meant when he said to be prepared to give an answer for the hope that's within you. This would be what would be called being a Christian apologist. Be prepared with an answer. Give hope to those who don't have hope. Give an answer to those who are seeking an answer. So, I'm giving you an answer today to these mass shootings. I'm suggesting to you, I gave 10 things that could slow it, but the overwhelming thing that is the solution to the problem is start addressing the root cause, and it's not a gun. If you took away every gun there was in the world and confiscated every bullet and every gun, do you think that would stop murder tomorrow? No, it wouldn't. So you have to address the root cause of man's hatred for his fellow man and why he would do something like this to a group of people indiscriminately and randomly that he does not know. It might be a challenge. It might be that your challenge comes about particularly challenging an issue in a particularly controversial environment. For example, an announcement that your local public library is hosting drag queen story hour for your kids. Or how our kids' school wants to integrate restrooms by gender identity. Or your neighbor, the one you love, but who always drops a racist comment. Or your radical environmentalist relative who drops an opinion bomb over a family dinner. Silence, pretending you didn't hear, and exiting left stage aren't good options. So how should you respond? Now this two mass shootings in 2 days, God's question for his people today. Horror, anger, grief, anguish, heartbreak, mourning, and shock. These are some of the emotions this morning, but surprise is not among them. And that's one of the tragedies of these tragedies. Watching national reaction to these tragedies, it seems to me that despair has captured our collective soul. We're afraid that no place in America is safe today. We can't put metal detectors at every store. Why not? We'll protect politicians. You have to get past a metal detector to get in a courthouse. You have to get it through a metal detector to get into the Capitol or the White House. Why shouldn't you have to go through a metal detector to get in anywhere where there is children? Why shouldn't there be metal detectors in schools? So if we did, murderers would just attack us in the parking lots. Well, okay, that's probably true, and we need to start hardening those parking lots. How do you know that wherever you're going won't be next? The fact is you don't. Dallas is not any safer than Dayton. A garlic festival in California is not safer than a Walmart in El Paso. A young man living in Allen, Texas, 20 minutes north of my home, drove 10 hours to massacre people in El Paso and is now one of the most infamous mass murderers in American history. On a morning like this, it's easy to wonder how the Christian message could possibly be relevant. In the wake of the El Paso massacre, the LA Times published a vitally important op-ed by Gillian Peterson and James Densley. These university professors run the Violence Project, a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to reducing violence in society and improving policy and practice through research and analysis. Working on a project funded by the research arm of the U.S. Department of Justice, they have studied mass shootings since 1966. Along with media, social media, manifestos, suicide notes, trial transcripts, and medical records, they have discovered 4 commonalities among the perpetrators of nearly all mass shootings they've studied. Number 1, the vast majority experienced early childhood trauma and exposure to violence at a young age. Number 2, nearly every mass shooter reached an identifiable crisis point in the weeks or months leading up to the shootings. Number 3, most of the shooters studied the actions of other shooters and sought validation for their motives. So again, this is absolutely key to this situation. When you are a potential person sitting and contemplating this, and you hear somebody say, well, this is the record tragedy that's ever happened in the United States of America, that may subliminally implant the idea in that young person's head that they need to exceed by doubling or upping the ante on their shooting. Number 4, they all had means to carry out their plans by obtaining weapons legally, illegally, or from family members. This is a study funded by the U.S. Department of Justice that has studied mass shootings since 1966. And they've looked at media, social media, manifestos, suicide notes, trial transcripts, and medical records, and discovered these 4 common things among the perpetrators of nearly all the mass shootings they've studied. As a result, Peterson and Densley recommend tighter controls of media sites that validate violence, improve security and weapons control, and proactive responses to those in personal crisis. That goes to number 1 point I make. Stop giving these media shootings wall-to-wall coverage when you have nothing to say, nothing new, nothing relevant to say, but you cover these shootings nonstop. All 3 major cable networks, from Fox News, MSNBC to CNN, do this wall to wall. And it should stop, and it should stop immediately, because people who are potentially in the queue, as they, so to speak, are watching. They're watching how our media covers these things. So we need to stop giving them this glory and this coverage that they seek. Their proverbial 15 minutes of fame, whatever it is, let's stop giving it to them. Jesus can change any life he touches. He can heal any trauma. He can redeem any crisis. The God who turned the murdering Pharisee into a missionary of grace can transform anyone. That's Paul. Do you believe that any person stands beyond the transforming power of the Savior's love? The more secularized our culture becomes, the more evangelistic our churches must become. The more people during a crisis ridicule our prayers, the more we need our prayers. The more traumatized and victimized our society, the more vital our compassion. The greater threat of violence, the more urgent our message. That's why we must do all we can to reach the next shooter before they strike. Jesus is weeping beside 29 graves today. He's calling us to join him with heartbroken compassion for the victims and their families in a recommitment to our gospel mandate. We're still the only light in the world, according to Matthew 5:14. The darker the night, the more crucial our light. One lesson of El Paso and Dayton is that every community is a mission field. As a result, every Christian is a missionary. This morning I hear the Lord asking, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" Isaiah says, "Send me, Lord. Send me." All right, well, we have a couple of more stories, but I'm going to hit our SRN news break right now, and we will be back after the top of the hour.
KPOG 102.9 FM, Grimes.
With SRN News, I'm Keith Peters in Washington. Stocks dropped 3% today on news that China and its ongoing trade war with the United States devalued its currency and halted purchases of U.S. farm products. Financial analyst Hillary Kramer says much of these losses are computer-generated.
This is very serious because trading on that level turns machines on. You know, a lot of this is artificial intelligence. Machine sees that kind of loss, and they continue with the selling. So selling begets selling in this world of smart, supposed computers.
Kramer edits Game Changers in cooperation with Salem Media. Investors fear that the escalating trade war between the two giant economic powers could do lasting damage to the world economy. They responded Monday by dumping stocks and shoveling money into U.S. government bonds, which are considered ultra-safe. That sent bond yields sharply lower. We're learning more about the suspect in the El Paso, Texas mass shooting that left 22 people dead.
Law enforcement officials identified him as 21-year-old Patrick Crusius of Allen, Texas, a Dallas suburb which is a nearly 10-hour drive from El Paso, home to many Latinos. Investigators are going over an anti-immigrant screed posted online just before the attack. Meanwhile, the suspect's grandparents issued a statement saying they are devastated and praying for the victims. They say that while his driver's license lists their Allen residence, he had moved out of their home 6 weeks ago. I'm Rita Foley.
Meanwhile, in the weekend's other mass murder, police worked Monday to pin down why a 24-year-old gunman killed 9 people, including his sister, in a weekend shooting rampage in a popular nightlife area in Dayton, Ohio. Connor Betts, who was wearing a mask and body armor when he opened fire in the bustling Oregon district early Sunday, was armed with an AR-15 style rifle. On Wall Street, the Dow down by 767 points. This is SRN News. What should the church do about racial reconciliation?
According to a new poll from the Barna Group, 28% of practicing Christians say there is nothing the body of Christ should be doing to bring harmony between the races. 26% believe the church has a responsibility to, quote, repair the damage, while another 26% say they really don't know what role Christians have to play in bringing about racial reconciliation in this country. 16% say the church needs to repent. Michael Harrington, SRN News.
The Trump administration is moving against illegal immigrants who are hiding out in churches around the country. Letters are coming out from immigration authorities threatening illegal immigrants with huge fines unless they come out of the churches and appear in court. It's unclear how many people have been targeted, but Church World Service is aware of at least 6 who've received letters. The government is legally empowered to enter houses of worship and remove illegal immigrants, but federal agents generally steer clear of such sensitive locations. This is SRN News. The day after Iran said it had seized a third tanker, the country's foreign minister has said that Tehran will no longer turn a blind eye to what it termed maritime offenses in the Gulf.
For Javad Zarif, his country's showdown with the U.S. has recently got personal after Washington put him on its sanctions list. Mr. Zarif said the sanctions were imposed on him shortly after he refused an invitation to meet President Trump at the White House. According to Mr. Zarif, the fact that he, as Iran's foreign minister, has been sanctioned, along with the country's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei, proves that the U.S. is disingenuous in claiming to want dialogue with Iran.
The BBC's Sebastian Usher. South Korea's president on Monday described the country's escalating trade war with Japan as a wake-up call to revamp its economy and issued a nationalistic call for economic cooperation with North Korea, which he said would allow the Koreas to erase Japan's economic superiority in one burst. More details at srnnews.com.
KPOG 102.9 FM, Grimes.
Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:10. From your friends at KPOG 102.9, the power of God. I am still confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. Psalms 27:13 and 14.
Every weekday on the Power of God, KPOG 102.9 FM, and live on webcast1live.com. Join us for a view from the pew. Should you be offended, provoked, triggered, intimidated, shocked, confused, or inspired to think independently, call our studio lines at 515-442-KPOG and join the conversation. After all, it's your voice we want to hear. The View from the Pew on KPOG and webcast1live.com. Weekdays from 4 to 6 on the Power of God.
Now, here's today's host, Frank the Verse Thomas.
Thank you. I am Frank the Verse Thomas, and we're here at View from the Pew. And that is heard every day, Monday through Friday, here at Jordan Crossing, and that's at the...
Live from the Yellow Blue Studios, your home for the light from LED Lighting. This is KPOG Grimes, West Des Moines.
If you'd like to comment on anything that we do on the show, you can do so, and feel free to do so by following these simple instructions.
We want to hear from you, so give us a call on the Service Legends Talk and Text line, 515-442-5764. That's 515-442-KPOG.
Well, so let's have a little bit of good news, here. God's given us a wonderful gift known as the United States of America. The government isn't good or bad. Her people determine her success or failure. So why would God ordain our government and then not want us to steward his gift? Many have been guilty of not getting involved by saying, well, we shouldn't say or do anything political. All we need to do is preach the gospel. Be careful. Although the gospel is our primary focus, this shouldn't be an excuse against action. James A. Garfield, an ordained minister and the 20th President of the United States, said, now, more than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If the body be ignorant, reckless, or corrupt, it's because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. We're actually voting for principles, not people. All candidates are sinners. Last time I checked, Jesus isn't running for any office except Lord of your life. In what direction will they lead our country is the question we should be asking. Even more importantly, is what country will we leave for our children? We don't have to abandon our ethics or compromise our principles to be involved in politics. What good is salt left in the salt shaker, or light that is hidden? Contextually, when Jesus referred to being light and salt, he was referring to holy living at the individual level, but overlapping principles apply to all areas of life. Politics shouldn't be a bad word. In simple terms, politics refers to governing or leading a group of people. No, politics won't save America, but in order to implement change and to help others, we must take action, hence the process. Would you have remained silent in the 1800s over slavery? Well, of course not. Politics that once focused largely on the economy, national security, and the deficit now tackles more important moral and social issues. These major issues have enormous implications. To remain silent actually makes a statement that we're not concerned enough. This is not just about the loss of jobs, it's about the loss of morality. We're not just talking about adding millions of dollars to the national deficit. We're talking about the abortion of millions of babies created in the image of God. We're not just talking about fluctuations in the housing market. We're talking about creating life simply to destroy it. This shift requires us to stay closely involved. Topics that are, quote, too controversial are often critically important, and we can no longer ignore them. Interestingly enough, the stability of America is one of the top concerns in the minds of many today. There was a time in recent history when America felt secure knowing that its most formidable enemies were abroad. Not so today. While we're concerned with terrorist attacks, and rightly so, there's a number of greater threats of corruption from within. We, like the mighty Roman Empire, have collapsed centuries ago and are crumbling from within. The people and the groups who are strongly committed to the destruction of anything rooted in our nation's Christian heritage. They attempt to be one nation, quote, above God, rather than one nation under God. Scripture identifies this as foolishness, self-exaltation, and arrogance in the downfall of every nation before us. There's a saying that one generation plants trees for the next. I'm concerned that instead of planting, we're removing and destroying the very covering that protects us. As a result, our legacy as a great and noble nation has been all forgotten. For example, most schools no longer teach students about the spiritual foundation that has guided America through her history. We've taken prayer and we've taken Bible out of the schools. Consequently, America's moral and religious heritage often deleted, grossly distorted, or revised altogether. Students miss the critical connection between America's unparalleled greatness to her rise in world leadership, the spiritual foundation that made it possible. This should concern us. The ideals of the classroom in one generation will create the ideas of government within the next. Today our culture promotes relativism. A man or woman who does right in their own eyes, again according to Scripture, to his own destruction. God's Word says to confront, confess, and turn from our sins. Relativism encourages us to ignore, overlook, and continue in our sin. Although this position may seem radical or extreme, we're living in extremely critical times, but make no mistake about it, we're witnessing a rapid deterioration of our nation right before our eyes. But this promise would likely only apply, 2 Chronicles 7:14 would likely only apply to a pure theocracy, which was Israel. But we can still apply it to our personal lives today. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people will humble themselves and pray, and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and heal their land. There are times to encourage, times to motivate, and time to uplift, but there's also times to confront and challenge and contend for what's right, and that time is now. Let it not be said of us today, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord. Judges 2:10. The day of the silent pastor who is more concerned about nickels and noses must end, and are we pleasing God or men? Are we cowards or are we watchmen? Here's an asteroid, 2019, near miss rocks scientism. Why a little humanity's in order. In the 1998 movie Armageddon, the administrator of NASA, played by Billy Bob Thornton, informs the president that a huge asteroid is on a collision course with Earth, and the president then asks, why didn't we see this coming? The administrator replies that their budget only allows them to track about 3% of the sky, and begging your pardon, sir, but it's a really big sky. This scene come to mind after reading about an asteroid designated 2019 OK. On July 25th, the 100-meter wide piece of rock passed within 73,000 kilometers of Earth. To put that distance in perspective, the moon is 384 kilometers from Earth. While the 2019 OK wasn't big enough to be a planet killer, it could have taken out a large city. I read once in a book by Marvin Moore that basically suggested that a meteor the size of a small red fire truck, if hitting the right spot in the world, such as the Amazon rainforest, could burn down 1/3 of the world's oxygen supply. And we've got any number of meteors that circles us in the sky. And I would suggest to you, guardian angels, holding back the four winds of strife, guide these things away from our planet. Even more uncomfortable was that no one noticed this big rock coming our way until it was almost on top of us. It wasn't being tracked, so it wasn't on any of the list of objects that would be passing near Earth. But as they say in sports, no harm, no foul. It jangled up some nerves, but no one was hurt. But our failure to detect 2019 okay until it was too late to do anything about it, still there's a lesson to be learned here. Though no one was hurt physically, our collective scientific ego should be hurt, or at least chastened. This consistent claims of omniscience afforded to science these days is proven once again to be a fallacy. Too often, what is called science is in fact junk science, scientism. Scientism holds that science, as defined by its proponents, is the only objective means by which we should judge things, that the only legitimate way we can know in the first place. Scientism masquerading as science is everywhere. Take recent Washington Post article entitled 5 Myths About Consciousness. One myth was that science will never understand consciousness. The author, after calling this idea pernicious, assured readers that the argument that difficult science problems are unsolvable has a very poor track record. After all, the entire profession, anesthesiology, is devoted to safely turning consciousness on and off again and again. See what he did there? He defined consciousness as essentially being awake, as opposed to what it usually means, the awareness of our own existence, thoughts, environment, and apartness from others. Drugging someone until they fall asleep doesn't bring you any closer to understanding consciousness than putting a person in a coma by hitting them with a blunt object. But claims to scientific omniscience requires this kind of reductionism. Usually claims of inevitable omniscience are like this, and most prestigious. The only real harm is us rolling our eyes far back into our heads that they stick. The danger of our arrogance is much more palpable when it comes to other issues, such as playing God with the human genome. As I've said several times on Breakpoint, gene editing technology such as CRISPR, CRISPR acronym, was made widely available with no ethical guidance than admonition to play nice. We simply cannot predict the physical and social impact of gene editing technology. Of course, that won't stop us. The potential disastrous process of trial and error with this technology won't cause us to admit we're nearly not as smart as we think we are. Or we might put it this way: tracking asteroids, which follow well-known laws of physics, is child's play compared to manipulating the human genome. And asteroids still manage to sneak upon us. If we don't learn from incidents like the 2019 unexpected flyby, our next surprise visitor could find out there is no one left to destroy. It's I would suggest that that God is holding back the winds of strife. He is in control until his people are sealed. Until his 144,000 are sealed, and then he instructs the angels to let go of those winds, and then it's game on, friend. Here's a couple of positive headlines I will just tell you. Churches across the U.S. pay off millions of dollars in medical debt for some people. I shared the story with you last week that a man donates his liver to a fellow church member he barely knew. A Chick-fil-A worker prays over a customer in a viral pic the Spirit led him. God put me here for a reason as a photo op of a one-handed soccer star, Carson Pickett, meeting with a one-handed toddler. And the 110-year-old woman we reported last week who credits God blessing her for her longevity. He's the one keeping me. Now here's a story that a church buys school supplies for every student at their local elementary school. A local church has made a wonderful, generous donation to a local elementary school, opting to purchase academic supplies for every single student that's due to attend. The Parkview Mennonite Church in Hillsboro, Kansas will cover the cost of every child enrolled in the Hillsboro Elementary School USD 410 grades through K through 5th grade this year. The idea came about after the local resident and churchgoer Tammy Drigger spotted a Facebook post which features a story of a church supplying a local school with much needed educational resources. After leaving the store and being a little bit in shock over how much supplies cost for my kids, I realized what a blessing it would be if a church could do it for Hillsboro. Then I thought, well, why not Parkview? You know, it's amazing in the world that there's always good stories like this in the midst of even the cesspool we live in. We have so much violence that goes on in the world. We just have people being kidnapped. We have people being kidnapped into bondage and slavery. We have into the sex trafficking trade. We have things going on all around us. We have murders. We have shootings. We have school shootings. And here's someone that wants to purchase school supplies for the kids in their city of Hillsboro, Kansas, covering the cost of every child enrolled in the Hillsboro Elementary School, grades K through 5th grade. So, even in the midst of suffering and despair, God is still alive and well. There's still acts of kindness that go on every day in the midst of these terrible acts of violence, but the acts of goodness and the kindness rarely get a mention. They immediately, if it bleeds, it leads in the news media. How about if it glorifies God, it leads? How about if our news media took the attitude, some praise and some glory to God, it leads our news network and our news stories for this evening? Put forth some goodness of God instead of the atrocities of Satan. I know we live in a world of evil and it's only going to get worse as we go. It's not going to get better. It's going to culminate and climax into Christ's second return. So, be nice to turn on Fox News. I think you'll see it more on Fox News than you'll see it on some of the others, but it would be nice to turn on Fox News in the evening and see a good story. To counteract these mass shootings. Put some good uplifting stories on the news that these potential new murderers that may come in the future, these potential coming new mass murderers that are formulating their plots as we sit here today. Put something in the media that uplifts God, lifts God up, instead of somebody slamming God, putting God down, ridiculing and mocking Christians. Lift God up. And maybe that next potential mass murderer may have something that counterbalances the evil that's in his heart. So you're listening to Frank the Verse Thomas here at View from the Pew. And we're going to get to our Sabbath School study. We're going to get to our Sabbath School study, and Jason says, "Hi, Verse." To which I say, "Hey, Jason. Good to hear from you, buddy." And Mac is listening. How you doing, Mac? Glad to have you tuned in. We're going to get to our Sabbath School lesson to catch up with the week here today. And I'm going to share with you a Sabbath lesson. And there is some assigned reading for this week. I'll start you out with Psalms 115, 1 through 8. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Their idols are silver and gold and the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but they do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. Did it ever stop and dawn on the people who was making the idol and fashioning it by their hands, that their hands and their eyes are stronger and greater than the God they create with their eyes and their hands? Make no graven image. I believe that is the... Let me just look that up. I believe that's the second commandment. Thou shalt have before me no graven image. Let me look up the 10 Commandments here, so I give it to you precisely. Commandment number 2, ye shall not make... This is the ESV version. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, serve them, for I am the Lord your God, only worthy of worship, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Let me see if I can get up Exodus 20, King James. Obviously, I'm more familiar with the King James Version. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or likeness of anything that's heaven above, or the earth beneath, or that's in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow thyself to them, serve them, for I am the Lord thy God, I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Graven images. Does it dawn on those who make a graven image that you are greater than the God you create with your hands? So you might as well just outright worship yourself. which is in some ways what they're doing. Here's Deuteronomy 10:17-24. For the God of your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribes. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner. Therefore, you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve him and hold fast to him, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise. He is your God, who has done for you great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. Psalms 101:1, I will sing of steadfast love and justice to you, O Lord. I will make music. This is from Isaiah 1:10-17. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ears to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, saith the Lord? I've had enough of your burnt offerings of ram, and the fat of your well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of your bulls, or your lambs, or your goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required of you this trampling of my courts? Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moons and Sabbaths is the calling of your convocations. I cannot endure iniquity in solemn assembly. Your new moons, your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They become a burden unto me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. And not, even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves. Make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Correct oppression. Bring justice to the fatherless. Plead the widow's case. You doing that, friend? Cry aloud, Isaiah 58. Cry aloud, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Declare to the people of their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the judgment of their God. They ask me of my righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why have we fasted, and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day of your fast, seek your own pleasure, and oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and fight, and to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your choice to be heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose, a day for a person to humble himself? It is to bow down his head like a reed, and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him. Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? This is not the fast I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness and to the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break the yoke. It is not to share bread. Is it not to share bread with the hungry and bring homeless poor into your home? When you see the naked, cover him. Do not hide yourself from your own flesh. Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring forth up speedily. Your righteous shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. Ye shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of fingers and spreading wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom shall be as noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire in scorched places, and make your bones strong, and ye shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. And your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt, and ye shall raise up the foundations of many generations. Ye shall be called the repairer of the breach, and the restorer of the streets to dwell in. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own way, or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly, then you shall delight in the Lord. And ye will make you ride on the height of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Then Jesus said, and in his teachings he said, beware of the scribes who walk around in long robes and light greetings in marketplaces, and have the best seats in the synagogue and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for pretense make long prayers. You ever heard anybody who makes long prayers in public? These long prayers, friend, weary man, God, and angels. Your long prayers should be made in private, where you can't weary God. You can pray as long as you want in your prayer closet, and you cannot ever weary God. But in public, different story. Is this, let me see, I already shared those verses with you. Even a quick reading of the Old Testament prophets alerts us to their concerns about the mistreatment of the poor and oppressed. The prophet and the God for whom they spoke were outraged about what they saw being done in all the surrounding nations. For example, Amos 1 and 2. But they also had a particular sense of anger and grief at the acts of iniquity done by God's people themselves, who had been the recipient of so many divine blessings, given their history as well as their God-given laws. These people should have known better. Unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. The prophets had a lot to say about this sad state of events. It is interesting to discover, too, that many of the best-known statements concerning justice and injustice from the Old Testament prophets are actually given in the context of instructions about worship. Pardon me. As we will see, true worship is not just something that happens during a religious ritual. True worship is about living a life that shares God's concerns for the well-being of others and seeks to lift up those who have been downtrodden and forgot. Now to Sunday. Idolatry and oppression. Soon after God led his people out of Israel, soon after God led the people of Israel out of Egypt, he met with them at Mount Sinai, giving them the 10 Commandments in written form. Now, as we know, God spoke audibly those commandments. Then he wrote the commandments with his finger in the stone tablets. The first 2 commandments are not, including the first 2 commandments about not worshiping other gods and not making idols. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Ye shall have no other gods before me. Well, you might think, well, I don't have any gods before God. I don't know. What about your hobbies? What about that car you spend more time working on and polishing on than you spend with your wife and your children? Your children are a gift of God. Your wife is a gift of God. You are the priest of that home, but yet you spend more time cleaning and polishing and detailing an inanimate object than you spend with the people who God has given you charge over. That's an idol, friend. That's an idol that you're putting before God. Ye shall not make for yourself a carved image, a graven image, or anything like that is in heaven above or that is in the earth beneath. Neither shall you bow down to them or serve them. I am your God. I am a jealous God. In response, the people promised to do everything they had been commanded and to live as his people. Exodus 24, 1-13. They said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and the people answered with one voice, all the words of the Lord has spoken, we will do. They promised with an oath that they would do all the words that the Lord had spoken them to do. Pardon me. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood, put it in basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people and said, all the Lord has spoken we will do, we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with these words. And Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel there under his feet, as it were pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief of men of the people of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. And the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction. So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. You hear that? All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. They promise to keep God's law. How long did they do it? 5 minutes? You know, we could have avoided a lot of problems if his people would have simply have kept God's law. You know, Ellen White makes the statement that had God's people remained faithful in Israel, if, the biggest word in the world, if God's people had kept to the dietary and the moral laws that God set forth, that Solomon's temple would have stood forever. Solomon's temple would have stood forever. But then Moses was gone up in the mountain for almost 6 weeks, and the people began to wonder what had become of him. Under the pressure from the mob, now remember, they had promised that they would do all that the Lord had commanded them to do. Aaron made a golden calf. Where'd they get the gold? It was from the gold and the jewels and the jewelry that they had taken from Egypt. Aaron smelted that gold down and made a golden calf and led the people in making sacrifices before it, after which they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Both the Lord and Moses were outraged at how quickly the people had turned away from God to idol worship, and it seemed that it was only Moses' intercession that saved Israel from its deserved punishment. The next day Moses said to the people, Exodus 32, "You've sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." But Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They've made for themselves gods of gold. But now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you've written." But the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now go lead the people to the place which I've spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them." Now I think if I recall the story, God melted the golden calf into the water source, and those who drank of that water died, because God basically drew a line in the sand and said, "Whom of you are going to serve me, get on this line, and who of you aren't going to serve me on this line?" And God pronounced judgment on the wicked. Idolatry, however, was a temptation God's people fell into way too easy. The reason they fell into this adultery is they couldn't stay away from the heathen. They couldn't stay away from the intermarriage of heathen women, and it always led them to idolatry and licentiousness. Always. Without fail. The history of the kings of Israel and Judah is punctuated by periods of idolatry, which includes the outrageous acts some of the kings led their people to commit in the worship of these gods. We think of Ahaz. We think of Ahab. We think of Ahab's marriage to the heathen princess Jezebel. We think of Hezekiah's father, Ahaz. Such unfaithfulness was a recurring focus of the prophets. God sent in order to call the people back to him, often too amid the calls for revival and reformation, for calls for the better treatment of the poor, the needy, and the helpless among them. Again, we will share Psalms 115, 1 through 8. And what's the critical point here? There's none but God. Their gods are of silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk. They do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them, so do all who trust in them. What's the point there? Again, the point is you're greater than the God your hands make and fashion. It's human tendency that we become like the thing or the person we worship and focus on. So it was only natural that concern for others and justice would diminish when God's people turned from worshiping a God of justice to worshiping the false gods of the surrounding nations, who are often styled as being gods of war or fertility. When they chose other gods, the people changed their attitudes in a lot of things, including how they treated others. Had they been faithful to the Lord, they would have shared his concern for those in need among them. Dwell more on the idea of becoming like what we worship. How do we see the contemporary manifestations of this principle? Well, as I spoke today early on, school shootings. Go home and sit in that comfortable chair. You know, those chairs you can play to play your video games. Have your remotes, have your beverage, and sit down at the worship of your accustomed idol. And massacre person after person of nameless, faceless entities in the game. Then when you're forced to go to school, because as some people call it, jonesing, and jonesing is something that would be akin to probably the cold sweats that the heroin addict would get. You're jonesing because you're full of anxiety and you're full of panic because you have to go to school. Then go to school in that panicked anxiety mode and be tormented and bullied in school, and then come home again day after day to play your accustomed games of mass murder. Do you think it's too far-fetched to think? Do you think it's too far-fetched to think that a young man or a young woman who has been so desensitized by that violence on those video games would think to pick up an assault style semi-automatic or automatic weapon, or change a semi-automatic into a automatic and go perpetrate these heinous acts upon the world? We're becoming what we worship. We're becoming what we behold. What we look upon is what we worship. We're to focus on God, the one true God, and when we focus on him, we become like him. Focus on the world, and you're going to become like the world. So a friend of the world is an enemy of God. And a friend of God is an enemy of the world. How about those who worship the drug culture? How about those who worship at the idol of their sexuality? Now Monday's lesson, a reason to worship. Throughout the Bible, God's people are urged to worship the true God, but we're also repeatedly offered reasons for doing so. We are told to worship him because of who he is and what he's done for us, and because many of his attributes, among these are goodness, justice, and mercy. When we're reminded of what God is like and what he has done for us, especially on the cross of Christ and what he promised to do, none of us should ever be without reason to worship and praise God. I will sing of steadfast love and justice and make music. But the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. For the earth brings forth its sprouts as a garden causes what is sown in it to sprout up. So the Lord will cause righteousness and praise to sprout up before all nations. You behold God, you will sprout up righteousness. What are the motivations for worshiping and praising in God, giving in these verses? We're going to become what we behold. It's just as simple as that. You behold evil cesspool, don't be surprised you become an evil cesspool. You behold the righteous God, you're going to become like the righteous God. Such reasons for worship are not new to God's people. Some of the most enthusiastic times of worship of the newly freed Israelites happened in response to the obvious intervention of God on their behalf. For example, after being brought out of Egypt and crossing the Red Sea, Moses and Miriam led the people in singing praise to God for what they had just seen and been rescued from. God's justice and mercy are revealed in such events and were not to be forgotten. As the people kept these stories alive by retelling them regularly, the acts of justice of God continued to be an inspiration for their worship years later and in following generations. One example of this retelling worship is recorded in Deuteronomy 10. For the Lord your God is the God and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribes. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow. He loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Ye shall fear the Lord your God. Ye shall serve him and hold fast to him, and by his name ye shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen. Your fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made for you as numerous as the stars of heaven. God's justice is, first, simply part of who he is, a core component of his essential character. It is unthinkable that God would do wrong, that the Almighty would pervert justice. That's from Job 34:12, New International Version. God is just and is concerned with justice, and that is a reason to worship and praise him. Second, God's justice is seen in his just and righteous acts on behalf of his people and on behalf of all who are poor and oppressed. His justice is never merely a description of character. Rather, the Bible portrays God who, quote, heard the cry of the needy. Job 34:28. They caused the cry of the poor to come before him so that he heard the cry of the needy. You remember when God confronted Cain and told him that his brother Abel's blood cried out from the ground to him? So the blood of all the martyrs of all time has cried out to God, and God will one day lay the wicked low and bring those precious martyrs from the dust of the earth to immortal life, and is active and anxious to right the wrongs that are so obvious in our world. Ultimately, this will be fully realized in God's final judgment and his recreation of the new world. If, question, ancient Israel had reason to praise the Lord, how much more do we, after the cross, have reason to praise him? Well, stop and think about, they were sacrificing an animal that was a prelude to God coming and dying on the cross. What if God had decided not to come? Then all their sacrifices would have been worthless and in vain. God told them, I take no delight in the blood of goats and doves and rams and pigeons. Better to obey than to sacrifice. We now have the privilege of looking back at Jesus' death. They were looking forward to Jesus' death. Which took more faith? I would suggest it probably took more faith to look forward to, because we now have the historical fact that Christ died. We now know the tomb is empty. We now know he is risen. I believe it probably took more faith to look forward to it and hope for it and long for Christ to come and die. Now, many people didn't believe that Christ came to die. Somehow he came to alleviate their oppression from and bondage from Rome, to deliver them from their oppressors. Peter, in fact, said, "Far be it from thee, God, that this should happen." Peter wanted to intervene and stop Christ from dying on a cross. Judas wanted to stop it because Judas had plans for Christ that involved Judas's gain. None of them understood his real mission, his real goal to accomplish on earth, and that was to die. So if ancient Israel had reason to praise the Lord before he died, how much more so do we, after the cross, have reason to praise him afterwards? Well, rather than to say who was best or who was worst or who had more faith or who had less faith, let's just agree that we both have reasons before and after the cross to praise him. Because he ratified the covenants. He validated the covenant. He validated the covenant with Adam and Eve. He validated the covenant with Jacob. He validated the covenant with Noah. He validated the covenant with Abraham. He validated his covenants by dying. And he validated the new covenant. He ratified it all in one act, in his death. So that all those who look forward to salvation gain salvation, and all those who look back at his death gain salvation also. So this has been Frank the Verse Thomas here at View from the Pew, and we will see you tomorrow.
KPOG 102.9 FM, Grimes.